Joe has a wisdom that transcends a lot of what we hear today. He has new information, which I have to tell you was new to me until I did my research when I got into subject matter. So I've learned a lot from him. He's young, he's brilliant. He's going to share with us something that I think will expand who you are and what you've previously known. We're honored to have you here, Joe. Thank you so much. Joe Dolezal.
Okay, I guess I'll start off by giving a brief introduction about who I am and how I came to the subject matter of the Upanishads and Magic, which was what we're going to talk about today. I originally started off around when I was 15 years old. I went to the University of Southern Florida as a math major, and I minored in physics. And my intention was really to discover a type of substantial truth behind how things work, you know, and that's kind of what you get when you start studying quantum physics or string theory. Then naturally you're attuned to try and see what the interrelationship between everything is, you know, beyond the molecular level, beyond the atomic level. You want to kind of figure out what the relationship between everything in the phenomenal universe is. That lasted about 5 years, and I was about 2 semesters away from getting my bachelor's in science at the University of Southern Florida until I literally had a minor or major revelation. I was in Calculus 3 analytical geometry class, and I don't know, I looked at the teacher, I looked around me at the kind of people they were, and I intuitively knew without a doubt that this is not where I need to be, this is not what's going to answer my questions. I had no idea where I was going to figure out what I needed to, but I walked out. I pretty much walked out, flunked the entire semester, and I never looked back, never went to college after that. And for a good reason, and I'm happy I did. Later what that did is it actually started, I guess, for lack of a better term, about 10 years ago I started getting involved in the conspiracy genre, and the whole like 9/11 thing, the you know, the Bilderbergers, the bankers, the Illuminati, that kind of stuff, and you know, the protocols of Lord Elders of Zion. I really was very heavy into that in about 10 years ago, which naturally, if you're honest with yourself, all roads lead to Rome, as they say, and all of that stuff really points back at some type of a substantial spirituality at the end of it, you know. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, nefarious or positive, but the basis of the authority of all these figures, whether it is the Illuminati, whether it is the Black Pope of the Jesuit Foundation, whether it's the Papal Rome or something else behind the scenes, it all ultimately leads back to magic or spirituality, magic. So that led about 3 years ago. That led me to a very fortunate organization, because I started saying, okay, well then what is this magic stuff? What is it? Is it concentration? Is it something inherent in some people? Is it invocation? Are we talking to spirits? Are we talking to God? What is it? How do you get, I guess for a lack of a better term, become a magician yourself? So that led me, actually, I was very fortunate to come across a book called Thought Power by a Swami Shivananda of the Divine Life Research Society, which is based in India. It's a very, very small organization, but you can find things on the internet about it. And these books essentially led me to a lot of what I know today in terms of magical relevance, and about Kundalini Yoga, about meditation, about intuition, about how to activate intuition, and pretty much it substantiated, or rather elucidated, brought to light a lot of what I had already suspected under the basis of the powers of Illuminati, or a lot of these dark organizations which really do know how to summon spirits, which really influence the entire world through the electromagnetic force. And it really led me on the path to showing how it's done. And what's interesting is that my earlier scientific, I guess, research, if you want to call it, through the physics and mathematics, substantiated all this across the board, which I guess led me to a lot more confidence in being able to talk about these things and really pursuing a life for it. So that brings us to the Upanishads, which we'll start off, and then we'll get into the magical aspect of it. The Upanishads are essentially commentaries. It's a Sanskrit word which means commentaries or instructions on the Rig Vedas. And the Rig Vedas are essentially, they are probably the oldest known religious, if you want to say religious cosmic doctrines that are known in the world today. Even formal academics, they will say that the documents go anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 years. That's what's admitted. Realistically, I personally, just like Jay and I talked about, I personally think that they're not from this time epoch. I think that they're probably Atlantean, they're the remnants of what survived. because it really, if you ever read it, essentially it's verses that are more about aphorisms. Aphorisms is a word which essentially means verses of truth. Something kind of like when Jesus said, "Seek and you shall find." That's what the entire Rig Vedas is. It's just, it's thousands of verses of these kind of aphorisms or truth statements, adages, if you will. And the fact that, when I did more research on it, a lot of the, the Western religions even themselves seem to corroborate back to it, because, we have Christianity, which is really Judaism, and Judaism really goes back to Egyptian, and the Egyptian really goes back to the Sumerian, and then, kind of gets hazy at that point, like nobody really knows. But at that point, we're really back in India anyway, so it goes back to the fact that, well, yeah, exactly, we're back in India, so we can really see that there's no reason to study Egyptian lore, there's no reason to study even Jewish Kabbalah. I mean, you can, but what I've discovered is that those texts are so allegorical, so veileded in mythology, if you will, that unless you're initiated, truly by a higher up in those doctrines, whether it's Gnosticism, whether it's the Kabbalah, whether you're even talking about the Sufism of Islam, you're not going to get it. You just won't, because if you take it for literal truth, you're missing it completely. Right. And so, that's another thing which kind of influenced me and really made me go back towards the Indian, because it seems like everything emanated from that, which goes back to the Upanishads. Why the Upanishads are interesting is because, like I said, they are commentaries on the Rig Vedas. The Rig Vedas are very hard to understand, because when you try to transliterate English from the Sanskrit, you're losing so much of the substantial quality of the message that it's really almost like you're not really doing anything. You'd be better off learning Sanskrit and reading in its original than you would in the English, because you're not getting anything from it. And so that's why I started reading the commentaries, which are the Upanishads, because the commentaries are essentially very thick volumes. He had asked how many were there. There's 10 major Upanishads commentary books. There's 108 minor ones, and then altogether there's about 256 Upanishads, which are, again, commentaries on the Rig Vedas, mystical commentaries. So we find that these commentaries are essentially volumes. I'm actually reading a 2-part volume right now, each are 700 pages, and that entire 700, or really 1,400 pages cumulatively, is about, probably just goes into about 50 verses, just so you understand how much could really be said about each verse. And the commentaries essentially elaborate on each verse. This is what this means, this is how it equates to spirituality, this is how you can apply it towards real life, and this is kind of the metaphysical substantiation behind that verse. And why I got so into it was because it seemed to almost undoubtedly justify the magic. It says that, controlling things with the mind is very simple. It's just a matter of concentration. And, when you ask yourself, well, how is that so? How is that possible? And then we go back to physics. When I studied physics, and even Berkeley professors will tell you this, we are essentially electrical beings as a human being. Everything is really electrical. It's at certain various states. But we as human beings are predominantly electrical. You just don't see that. When you concentrate, you're basically taking all the electrical energy within your body and you're focusing it. Now, think about this example. You have the lights in the room which can light up this room dimly, or vaguely, but if you take that same light and concentrate it, you can cut through steel. It's just light. All you're doing is concentrating the same force, and now it's cutting through steel, which you yourself couldn't bend if you tried, That just goes to show and substantiate the power of concentration. What concentration, when you take something and you make it super potent and direct it, channelize it, what it can actually do. Now, the mind and the body really being electrical being, when we concentrate stuff, what happens as a byproduct or an inevitability of concentration, electrical concentration, is magnetism. That's what it is. Basically, when you have an electrical force or a wire and electricity runs through it, by default, magnetism is the byproduct of electricity. It's one and the same thing. It's not two forces. Physics will tell you it's two forces, not two forces. It's a byproduct. It's one and the same thing, really. It's just a different expression. Now, why that's important is because it goes back to the term magic or magi, magnetism. It's the same thing, actually. When you study what the etymology of the word magi is, or magician, it's one who controls the electromagnetic force. Now, that's what's very interesting, as I discovered that, is essentially what the magi are is individuals who can control and wield the electromagnetic force through concentration, which is interesting because, yoga talks about that, concentrate, and you can be able to you start activating certain chakras, which are the elementals. We first have the the earth, and then the water, then the fire, then the air, and then the Akashic, and then, and then Anya. And that's what it essentially is when you concentrate on these certain elementals, and when you concentrate on them, then you activate that specific electromagnetic charge, and you have the ability to control things, essentially through the concentrative effort. And what I thought was interesting about that is that it corroborates with even physics, with mundane physics. The more you concentrate on something, you basically charge something electrically, and electromagnetic force is created around it. And what's interesting is, if you take that a little bit further, what light actually is the intensification of that process. When you have a light, what that really is electricity running into a tungsten. It creates a magnetic charge, and then the higher it goes, it starts emitting photons. That's another inevitability of electricity, which goes back to when you see saints or Jesus having the halo around them because they're lit up. That's what that actually is. It's probably literal light actually emanating, which there's a lot of cases even in medieval Europe. Sages, emitting a fluorescent light. That's where we get that. They're of the light, because they're literally emitting light because their concentration is so magnanimous that it actually starts emitting light. Literally, you can see that in eyes. If you ever come across yogis or people that are truly spiritual, people who are heavily involved in meditation or just some kind of an activity where they're focused, if you ever notice their eyes are really glossy, because that's that light that's really starts shining through, and then maybe at a lower echelon, lower level, but nonetheless, that's that effect that's starting to take place. And so that's what the Upanishads are. They're essentially commentaries or instructions, I would even say, on how to activate this process, how to become attuned to this process. And science does really collaborate with it, and it explains it across the board. But if you don't make that correlation, then it doesn't really make any sense, because you're just taking it for a mechanical something, and you don't make the sense that you're actually the forces that they're talking about. You have that electricity, you have that magnetism, you have that magical potential within yourself. And that's kind of the conclusion that I came to in terms of magic, why I wanted to study it. Now, why I wanted to study it was kind of what I was mentioning a little bit earlier in terms of the basis of the authority of a lot of these ruling elite, because I would just ask myself, and I used to say this when I was even in my teens. Me and my dad used to talk about this. I used to say, what is the basis of these authorities? Because even if it's financial, why wouldn't they just trump the Vatican, crush them, kill them? That's what they do. They see opposition, they get political, diplomatic, and then they just come and close in on it, kill them, make it look like it was their fault because they attacked them first. That's just how they operate. And so why wouldn't they do that? Because when you have the Vatican, you essentially have bishops and the Pope. They're essentially old people. They can hire an army just to dissipate them in a manner, but they won't, and they never have. The Vatican has never been attacked, which is interesting. 2,000-year history, it is the only place in the world that has never been attempted to even be taken over. And you have to ask yourself why. What is resisting people from doing that? And we know it's not because human nature is nice and amenable and friendly, because it's not. It has nothing to do with that. It has something to do with something much more substantial, which is the basis of their authority won't allow these types of people to be overthrown, and it has to be magical at the end of the day. I discovered something relatively recently about a book, just off an off tangent. It was about merchants and the Medicis, and how the Medicis essentially they started coming up in the 12th, 13th century, and they actually took over the Vatican probably around the 1500s. What's interesting, there's two parts that are interesting to that. I bought a book. It was called The Vatican. It was a very Barnes and Noble's, very, I guess, if you will, a very amenable book. It was not a controversial book. It wasn't a conspiracy theory book. It was just something that you would give to the average person. And it's interesting because there's several things that were said in that book which went back to Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, which really kind of hit home to me. There was a quote that actually Pope Boniface in the 13th century said that there's two types of swords that are wielded in this world. The one that are wielded by the kings and the soldiers, which the kings really give authority to the soldiers, and then there's the ones that the priests wield, which gives the authority to the kings, actually. So, that we might have the illusion that kings are the ultimate power, presidents or even bankers or financial institutions are the ultimate power, but they're not. By any stretch of the imagination, it explicitly said that it's the popes that give the power to the world. And why that was interesting is I go on a little bit further, and I noticed that from the 15th century, we essentially see the popes, they shift from a tiara, crown, and certain types of royal capes, they wear white or they would wear purple or whatever it be, just strictly wearing what we would identify as the Jewish yarmulke, and also the red cloaks that they started wearing. Now, why that's interesting is because a few things. The Medicis were known as essentially worshippers of Mars, if you will. And you know, because their planet of worship was Mars. It represents activity, potency, essentially any kind of like the active principle of the universe. You know, they move the universe. Now, what's interesting is the Rothschilds. That's a German word which means red shield. So you know, there were several things, that in itself, then corroborating with like a book that I read called The Empire of the City, which essentially says there's a ternary in the world which has all the power, and it's essentially spiritually with the Vatican, it's financially with the Bank of England, and then the military muscle of the world is the United States, but it's a triangle, and they listen to each other in succession. In other words, you know, the United States actually has to bow to England, and England actually has to bow to the Pope, the papacy. Now, with all that said, it still goes back to the question of why. Why do they listen to him? You know, it's just, you know, some people that are in a room and they wear capes, and what's the basis of listening to them? You know, are they really that spiritually wise that, you know, people would, you know, bow to them and essentially take their advice and listen to them? And it comes out that even in the Medici book, and even in that Vatican book that I bought, it was a very well-known thing. Blavatsky substantiated this a number of times, that all the popes essentially from around the 1400s on were magicians. They were sorcerers. That's a known thing. It's not a question. They are sorcerers. They probably got their knowledge as a result of Turkey being invaded in the 1400s. If you guys know your history a little bit, there was a big Turkey, Istanbul, around the 1400s was probably the biggest library at the time. It really was like Alexandria was in its heyday 2,000 years ago. And it was being invaded from the Muslims, so the Turkish didn't want to give their knowledge in their books. And what had happened is when they knew the Turkish were coming, the Italians, or the Medicis at that time, which were huge financial bankers, said, listen, you know, we'll buy whatever you guys have. We'll give you money, you guys can fund your war, do whatever the hell you want, but we'll buy all your books. I think what happened is they came across some knowledge when they did that, because they sold, you know, like the Library of Congress style. We're not talking about, you know, a couple thousand, it was volumes. And so I think around that time they came across certain knowledge which really justified their authority, and I think it was really magical at that time. Nostradamus himself basically said around the 1500s on, everything's going to be bad in terms of politicians. They'll always be dishonest. Government will always be corrupt, and he never substantiated why, but again, this would corroborate with the fact that around the 1500s, you see that in the book. You see a chronological, you know, basically the popes, they wear tiaras, which represents a feminine power. I don't know how many of you know that. And then all of a sudden it shifts from tiara to red yarmulke, red cape, almost for 350 years. You can see, because there's, you know, there's the images of the popes, basically, are chronological images. And, you know, and then again, once again, it kind of came back to that point where, you know, everything started substantiating itself again. You see that the magic really is kind of a very high authority in this world, and it really is the basis of why everything works. In the Bible, if you know, some of you are probably familiar with the Bible, the magicians of, you know, that discovered, the three magi that discovered Jesus, they were from a place called Claudia, which was a place called Medea. Medea in ancient Claudia, which was, you know, it doesn't exist anymore. But what's interesting is Medea is spelled exactly like the word media. And media, when you discover what media is essentially, it is the electromagnetic force, which is channeled through certain avenues to influence the masses of people. That's what it is. You have radio technology, you have digital technology, you have internet technology, you have cell phones. All of it is electromagnetic, all of it. And those channels influence you. They do. I mean, think about it. Like, where did you learn your identity, that you were black, white, you know, skinny, fat, man, woman? Where did you learn all that? Somebody told you that. It's not your own. It's not really your own accord. It's all basically millions of minor inculcated subtle influences on your entire body throughout your whole life that you don't even really know yourself, which is kind of interesting because we act in accordance with a social whole and we're influenced by that. Now, why that's interesting again is because it goes back to magic. What is magic? Magic, by its very definition, is the willful or conscious influence or control of the electromagnetic force to influence your environment around you. That's what, you know, Golden Dawn definition of magic is. The Golden Dawn was a type of revival in the late 1800s where they tried to revive magic, but then it was infiltrated, and then they basically brought the whole thing down with things like Houdini and stuff like that, because they tried to make magic look more like hoaxsters and tricksters rather than a legitimate art, because, you know, they don't want to empower people. You know, that's kind of what led me to, you know, the Upanishads. The Upanishads are essentially commentaries which go into very, very detailed instructions on how to activate these certain things. And really what it comes down to, what it ultimately boils down to when you can get past your own psychological inhibitions, is the ability to concentrate your own mind. And when you do that, then an electromagnetic force happens as a result of that, which if you can just willfully imagine it, then that electromagnetic force will literally start influencing the environment around you. I don't know if any of you have ever had experiences where maybe, you know, you've turned on lights or broke lights, or if you're very angry and something happens where you break something like your cell phone. That's probably what that is. You're not conscious of it, but that's probably what you're doing if you're very angry, if you're frustrated, and you grab a cell phone and the damn thing like breaks or something. I don't know, you know. That's probably what's happening, but you're not aware of it. And then if you keep going past that, which is what they even corroborate with in the Yoga Sutras, is that, you know, it's mentioned that you should not practice magic because it'll bring you actually much lower. That's, you know, and it's just kind of ironic that we're having this, but they said that magic is going to be an inevitable byproduct of your spiritual journey. The objective is liberation, and liberation of the phenomenal senses from this world. Because the idea is, and I don't know how much detail I'll go into it, but the idea is that human existence is actually a curse. What it means is that we all at one point were in paradise. We were in a conscious something. We were in God, and that's kind of like what the story of Satan is, you know, the initial fall of the human race is that we wanted to express ourselves individually, and so we came out of conscious, you know, wholeness, if you will, for lack of a better term, and took on a physical personality so we can express those tendencies that we wanted to express when we broke away from the unity. And so the human existence is really one of pain and suffering, because what happened is you try to assert an independence from God or from the unity. And so our whole objective in the human form is really to escalate back up into that unity. And that's really what the basis of spirituality and religion is, even when religion is kind of skewed, I think, and it's used for different purposes. That was the original objective of it. When we start escalating up towards the echelons of spiritual liberation, phenomenal liberation, and getting our consciousness back to that highest source, or back to the source of the absolute, if you will, then a natural byproduct is magic. The Yoga Sutras, even the Upanishads, ironically say to ignore it, because what will happen is that if you get involved in magic and you're aware of it, then what's going to happen is, without you knowing, is your ego is going to take over again and bring you much more down, because you're going to be a showman, you're going to try to help the world and save the world and this kind of stuff. And you're actually going to fall much lower than you were initially, because now you have something to substantiate. You know, you'll get a lot of attention, you'll become famous, and that does nothing but ossify the ego again, and then you're right back to ground zero, except for, you know, magic, I guess. That's some of the interesting things that I discovered, is, you know, that the magic and the sorcery really is real. Spirit evocation is real. Magic is very real, and it turns out that it's the basis of a lot of these authorities. If you guys ever seen Eyes Wide Shut, you know, that scene where that really obscure sex scene that they're having right before the sex scene, where they're having that dance. If you ever see where they're having that strange dance, the guy's in red. The guy's in red because that's probably about showing the Martian power. You know, it's basically an active principle, which is giving life to certain things around it. That's why women are always in black, and because women are supposed to represent essentially the core, the foundation, where men are supposed to be the active principle, which kind of goes into the Kabbalah a little bit. That whole thing with magic is very interesting, and that's kind of the conclusions that I came to, is that really magic does rule the world. You know, Jordan Maxwell even said that in one of his things. John Dee even mentioned that. And it seems like a very, I guess, obscure concept, because you know, it seems so far off from what we're taught, but it really is hidden in plain sight. It's hidden, it's everywhere. You know, the medias that control you. You know, why would they choose that word out of any word? You know, like out of any word that they can choose, why would they choose that word specifically? Like when you see the influence of that kind of stuff, you know, like they've had cell phones since the 1800s, you know, and they're releasing it now, 100 years later. Then, you know, you have to ask yourself, why are they doing that?
I was just watching Jordan Maxwell.
Yeah.
There's online on YouTube. You can see him giving presentations from the 11/11/11 alien event. And he's sitting in an office, and behind him is a bookcase. There's one book you can see called Stolen Lightning.
Stolen Lightning, that's the paperback book about magic, right? And that is it, right? And it was based off something much more substantial originally. And then as they dumb it down, and it's just like anything else, you know. It's just like what they did with like cell phones. They introduced cell phones, and when people get accustomed to it, they regulate it. You know, it's like drugs. They introduce drugs, then they regulate it, and they put people in jail. And I think that's what it was. You know, they introduced spirituality so people would, you know, they would believe in it. And then when they established authority, they didn't want people to be independent, then you had the witch hunts, you know, and magic was essentially illegal. It was like modern terrorism at that time.
It was competition.
It was competition, exactly. They don't want that. So, you know, they said they were not of Jesus, they were of the devil. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to briefly talk about this. And at, you know, at that location that I'm building, the Pyramid Center in the mountains, I want to teach these kinds of things to people, because from all of my, talks with people, everybody has these theories that you can overthrow the government, buy gold and you'll overthrow the government. Do this, and then you realize that it's, then when you go back to it, then it's the Bank of England that controls the price of gold. So it's like, what are you really doing? All they're going to do is get everybody to buy the gold, then they're going to drop it down, and now you're poor again. And they will do that. That's what they do. So, you really have to extricate yourself out of the system, and the only way you do that is, first of all, you have to understand the basis of their authority. Why do they rule? Why? That's the question. Because once you figure that out, then it's just clockwork. And if it's magic, then you learn magic, and then you're on the same level as them, but much more stronger. Because if there's, I don't know, say 300 of them, but there's 300 million of us, there's not even going to be a fight. It'll just die out naturally, And if you just have to educate people about their true relationship to God, their true potential, their true ability, and then it's just clockwork at that point. You don't have to fight. You don't have to buy gold or whatever they want.
But then once you become more powerful than them, then you're in control, and you're like, well, what do I do now?
Right, and there's that dynamic, right? And there is that natural dynamic where some people would naturally get it and some people wouldn't. But it's like, I guess what it is it comes down to the question of knowledge. We do live in a time where it's very hard. It's very hard to hide the truth at this point. They even said, like, when the Holocaust was happening, a lot of people didn't know that actually was happening until after the fact, because there's just no information, there's no technology, and if you really weren't part of the group that held that whole thing together, you would really have no way of knowing, because people that went into that, they didn't come out. So, how would you really know? And now it's like, you can communicate with Japan in 5 minutes. You can get people who can show you these things, and then you can do an email blast with 1 million people, and the information's just out there. It's not like you can suppress it. It's out there at that point, But I understand what you're saying, because that is a legitimate concern. It's a question of, naturally there's different proclivities in people. Some people are smarter than other people. Some people are more spiritual than other people. Some people are more sensitive than other people. That's just how it's made. So you would naturally have this hierarchy. And I think there's nothing you can inevitably do to avoid that. Because even Albert Pike essentially said, though we hope for peace, there'll never come a time in this world where there'll be peace. There won't. Because too many people, the karmic differentiation between people, the fact that there's new souls here, there's old souls here, there's demonic souls, there's good souls, it's just too much of a variegation for there to be peace across the board. Now that doesn't mean, it comes to a question like, if somebody is better than somebody, why does that automatically mean that you have to suppress them? Why does that mean that you have to beat them up? Why does that mean that you have to milk them for what they're worth? It's like, if you see that a dog is not as intellectual as you are going to beat it up just because it's not as intellectual as you? It's a mindset, and the problem is that people who run the world have a mindset that the rest of humanity is garbage. But the problem is they don't understand where their authority even came from. They're just rich. They were born into it. Their grandpas were born into it. Their great-great-grandpas were born into it. So naturally you're going to get this unjustified egoism, which is the problem that we have today.
Well, in some situations you could see where certain people could go out and just kill everyone else.
Right. That's true. But there's karmic repercussions to take into consideration. That's the thing. When you start getting to those avenues of spirituality where you start dabbling in magic, then I think what comes in conjunction with that is a very very severe understanding of karmic repercussions. And you can do that. You can kill people all day, but it will come back to you. And if you understand that, then you have to take into consideration why some people are born mentally retarded, why some people are born without a leg. You don't know what they did in their past life or the life before that or life before that. And I don't think, and I'm going to make a broad statement, I don't think God makes mistakes. I think everything is exactly the way it ought to be. Exactly. And our problem is the perception of things. Oh, why is that person homeless? Why is that person, why does that woman got raped 10 times? It's like, you don't know what these people did in their past lives. I don't think God makes mistakes, and I think it's karmic repercussion. I think it's the universe trying to equilibrate itself. So that really solves that, and if you're a magician, then you ought to know about karma and karmic repercussion and cause and effect, because that's what that comes down to.
Will there always be born conflicts? Absolutely.
Right.
But as an individual, how can I influence this? Can I influence it with more
example? Through example.
Exactly.
Learn it and then through example, because
Yes.
you don't need to preach anything. If you have $1 million and that person doesn't, they're going to want to know how you did it, and they're going to take the time to figure it out. You don't have to preach anything. That's one thing I realized when I used to work for Cat Williams. That's one thing I realized. I don't know, he's a comedian. I don't know how many of you know.
Yes.
But by chance, I got a job with him, and it's just amazing because when I started talking to his girlfriend and his friends, and he basically, when he was my age, he was sleeping on couches, he was homeless, and then you go to his huge Calabasas mansion, he has a Ferrari, and Lamborghinis, and it's just like, my question was, how the hell did he do that? It's kind of inspirational. So the point is that you just have to live by example. Don't preach anything. Preaching exists. You don't need to live by example. If you have these powers of healing people, people are naturally going to want to know how you did it, and they themselves will devote the time to figure it out.
Very good.
The Bible thing definitely makes sense that you kind of have to be brought into some of this because I was in a group last night and some guy was talking about how somewhere in the Bible it says when you start walking the path of light, you have to let go of all the alcohol or drugs or whatever like that. And I guess if what you're talking about controlling the electromagnetic force, probably being heavily influenced might have some bad consequences.
If you use it for nefarious reasons, that will all come back to you. It has to. It has to. Right, it has to, because the law of the universe is equilibrium. So if you take from here, it's going to take from you on the backside, and you might not know it because due to ignorance or a lack of understanding of how that cause and effects works, but it does work that way. Yeah.
Why in the world do these people who want to control everything else not realize what you just said, that the basic law of the universe is equilibrium?
I think
these people who want to master everybody else show a definite lack of self-mastery.
It does, and that's what's ironic about this whole thing, is that they have a certain spiritual power, but there's a number of reasons. One, I think it's because they've been born into it so many generations, they've lost in touch with that essence, That's the first reason. I think the second reason is also, don't forget that these people are working on astrological terms. And I think what they're doing, there's a saying in spirituality that spiritual law supersedes ethical law. And there's some validity to that, but I think what they're saying is that their cause is so great, it doesn't matter. If one person dies, pretend to live good, so be it. The whole New World Order thing has a much more bigger story behind it. Most of you are familiar with the precession of the equinox, which is essentially that we're in the Piscean age right now. We have been for about 2,000 years, and we're coming out of it. According to Masonic dogma, Scottish Rite Masonic dogma, we entered into where we officially started exiting out of the Piscean era at around 1845. 2012 is the halfway mark from Piscean to the Aquarian age, and then sometime around like 2200 plus or minus is the official point where we are completely out of Piscean and we're into Aquarian. We're into the constellation of Aquarius. Now, why that's significant is because Aquarius is responsible for humanitarianism, globalism, people being more consciously aware of their neighbor. It's not going to be about diversification. It's not going to be about racism. It's not going to be about economic poverty or socioeconomic distinctions. But it's going to be about this uniform, thing across the board wherever, like, we're going to live in a world of peace. Being that those individuals understand spirituality and that they have the resources, I think they're playing heavily off of natural influences, and that's why you see we're trying to help the world. But what they're doing is they're killing people, but they're trying to help the world. They want to introduce they want to introduce a social standard, but really that's communism. And the problem is their ultimate reasoning might make sense because what they really, I think, believe that they're doing a good to humanity, but it's, not every path that you're leading is necessarily benevolent. Their justification is the means justify the end. If we want everybody to be happy, we just got to kill some people. That's what it comes down to. But I think that's how they do it, and they believe that the stars support them. Because they understand this, they're not stupid. Why do you think the astrological symbols are everywhere in Missouri, everywhere in Washington, D.C.? They're not stupid. They understand this probably a hell of a lot better than I do or any of us do. That's why they are in power, not because they're stupid, but because they are smart. But I think, there's that lack of humanitarian feel, and then what's really happening is there's really a blasphemy going on, because they're saying, well, I'm not going to let God naturally evolve the situation. We're going to take it into our own matter.
Yeah, that is blasphemous.
And what that's going to have is repercussions, because what I say is people are ignorant, but they're not stupid, which means essentially they don't know intellectually, but intuitively everybody knows there's something wrong. And I think what needs to happen is that we, just like you said, we need to have people that have examples. If you have, the reason people don't go out of the system is because there's nothing else to do. Like, nobody wants to go live in a cave by themselves, minus a phone, minus food, minus company, minus, social activity. Nobody can do that. It's very hard. Some people can, most of society can.
Only
Sounds
Jay.
good to me.
Jay can, right?
Jay can.
I'm on that path too, but not yet. And you know, and with that said, the problem is people are in their circumstance because they don't know how to extricate themselves out of it. But if something better came along, you know, people would fly on it. They would just jump on it. And there really is a dual benefit to all these wars and economic conflict, because even though it's bad right now, what would people have to lose if they already lost everything? That it's only a boon, because then if you can present something like what I'm trying to do, for example, you know, where we have like self-sufficient societies where the objective would be more like spiritual rather than material, why wouldn't people go to that? You already lost your house, you lost your car, you lost your job.
Yeah.
It's not a hard decision to make at that point.
Right.
And so, you know, everything is a double-edged sword, and I think that even though we're coming into bad times, there's an equally positive aspect to this.
Balance.
Yeah, and you know, and that's why I personally don't. I'm not worried. I think it's a good thing. I just think we have to see. You know, you have to see the opportunity. You know, and I think what they're trying to do. I know what they're trying to do. I don't think they'll be successful in the end. I really don't. I honestly, in my heart, don't, because it's not that people will uprise. People won't uprise. They'll collapse on themselves, because I think they'll get so arrogant, so
balance too
Yes.
far
right.
in that direction. It's got to
That right, and because they'll become so belligerent, so arrogant, that it'll crush under their own weight, because it'll polarize too hard to one side. You know, what are you going to do if people are so stupid they can't work? And they're, you know, like, what do you want to do? You know?
But again, how the universe works, I mean, out of chaos comes harmony. You know, so you
It's that ever essence of, you know, the flow and ebb of things, and that's just inevitable. Like you even mentioned, how do you know that people aren't going to learn this magic and then use it for their benefit? They will. That's already happened. That's why we are in the place we are. But you know, once, like we talked about before, the Upanishads and the Yoga Sutra essentially say that the human existence is a curse. It really is, from a spiritual perspective. You messed up somewhere spiritually, that's why you're in this body. And it really does make sense. And it really does make sense, because think about it. I mean, you know, you're a kid, you know, then you grow up, you have to get a job, you know, you might have health problems, you have family problems, you have relationship problems, you have to always work just to maintain an existence, always do something against your will. You get hungry, and you get, you know, then you get full, and then it's a painful experience. You wake up, you go to sleep. It's like, when you really, you know, analyze it, from exactly, and then one day you just drop dead, you know, after your wife's left you, after your kids, you know, your kids might be on drugs. Right, and your dog died, and you lost your house, you lost your job, and you have to put gas in your car when it costs $5.
Joe, can you tell us more about the Pyramid Center?
Yeah, I was very fortunate enough a while ago to acquire a big plot of land in the San Bernardino Mountains. It's about 237 acres. And it's off of, for those of you who are familiar, it's off of the 330 highway up towards Running Springs. There's an exit, like a turnout, if you will, on a dirt road, which goes back for 15 miles. And then I have this big plot of land back there, which for, you know, whatever reason or another, I decided I wanted to do many things up there. One of them would be like a type of self-sufficient community, not for the sake of trying to, you know, create a little place where, you know, we would survive a particular doomsday apocalyptic thing. 'Cause I personally don't believe in that. I don't, you know, I mean, you know, I don't, you know, I mean, I think there will be bad things that'll happen, but it's very isolated in compared to into the grand scheme of things. But it's more like what we talked about. If you can provide a model example of how people could live, duty-free, obligation-free, you know, to certain hierarchical forces, who wouldn't take that? Who wouldn't take the fact that you can have electricity for free, water for free, housing for free, you know, food for free? I mean, who the hell wouldn't take that? But
Are you familiar with the Rainbow Family Tribe?
it sounds very familiar, very familiar.
These are people who use no money at their gatherings.
Right. Well, there's a lot of organizations out there that are already doing that. Yeah, there's
Love.
right.
And sustainability
Yeah.
of the environment.
There's a lot of people that are doing that in like Arizona and Nevada. I know there's a lot of organizations that are doing that, but you know, one of the main problems is, and you know, I don't want to sound mean, but they're too much of hippies to promote it to big people, you know.
Oh,
And that's
the stigma of
right. They're just kind of, you know, I guess for lack of a better term, they're too humble about it. It's like, you know, you're doing your thing, that's cool, but 300 million people out there that could use what you're doing don't know about it.
Don't know about it.
You know, and so I guess with that said, you know, I guess maybe I'm a little bit more bold in that respect, that I'm not shy about advertising. And I think that's something that's necessary, because even when it's completed, I don't want more than a few hundred people live there at tops. You know, it's the objective really of it is a model example. You know, you don't want to be a slave to the system. It's horrible. I'll tell you why it's horrible, but this is what you can do to remedy it. You know, there's no reason to talk about something if you have no solution. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to. You know, you have to extricate yourself out of the system. If you're not willing to break your relationship away from the powers that be, you will never be free. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. You could drive a hybrid, you could drive an electrical car, it doesn't matter. you're still in the system.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the definition of magic is
Magi, right? M-I-G-I.
Yes.
And magi means magnanimity. It's basically magi. It's
willful control of
magic. Yeah, magic is basically, by definition, the way at least the Golden Dawn magical sector cult defined magic was that magic is the willful control of the electromagnetic life force to influence your environment or your outside environment. That's it.
And then I've learned there's three forms. There's to control outside circumstances, other people, and then your mind, which would be the internal.
Right.
And then to raise your consciousness is the highest form of
Right,
magic.
right, because magic is actually not the highest form of spirituality. Magic is probably on a scale of 1 to 10 like a 7 or an 8. True liberation, which is what they say like Buddha was or Jesus was, a lot of the yogis is, which essentially is, by definition, liberation or Christ consciousness is when essentially your consciousness raises absolutely above the phenomenal duality of the universe.
Could that be considered a state of sovereignty?
It is. That is what sovereignty is. That's actually that's
The real state of sovereignty.
exactly. That's really that's the real status of sovereignty. When you talk about sovereign heirs or the Pope being sovereign, the idea behind it, the spiritual theory behind it is that he is a liberated soul. Of course, we know he's not.
Fortunately, he's not.
Right, and that's the idea of even kings. Is kings, when you read things like Albert Pike, then what they even call magicians originally, when we talk about the justifications of kings or magi or the Pope or any of these spiritual authorities, the idea is that they're supposed to be consciously liberated from the phenomenal existence, and therefore they can govern society better. That's what the word king means. It means an arbitrator, somebody who can govern the phenomenal forces because he himself is liberated. That's what the word king actually means. Of course, that's not true today. Or the popes, at best they're just sorcerers or black magic.
And their practice of magic shows their heavy hand and the method that they enforce their control.
Absolutely.
And if humanity could raise its consciousness.
I don't know if you know this, but, for example, the brain, when we talk at like this frequency, your brain actually operates from anywhere from 35 to 50 hertz. Everywhere in the world, it is illegal for any kind of electromagnetic communication to emit 50 hertz, but in the United States. Bet you didn't know that. Your television actually emits 50 hertz. Because it interferes with your brain. So when you're watching TV and you're like,
Yes.
that's hypnosis.
Yes,
that is true
absolutely.
hypnosis. That
Yes,
is
it
hypnosis because the signal which is emanating, the light, from like back in the CRT tubes, the tube TVs, the CRTs,
Yes.
cathode ray tubes. Then it was literally emitting photons at 50 hertz. So when you're like, staring at a TV, you're literally getting brain dead. That's hypnosis. That is it. And like I even said, when you see, you just think about culture. Like where did you learn that you were who you were? That's all just thousands of, inculcated forces coming from every side since the day you were born. And you think you're this person, you think you're that person. It's essentially influence, and that's why it even goes back into some of the sovereignty concepts that everything's voluntary. Nobody really forces you to do anything. You have to do it out of necessity because of your ignorance. Well, there is that problem of hierarchies dominating over hierarchies, and it's a human problem because some people just come in more naturally attuned, some people less attuned, and that's really the result. That's really the basis of hierarchical existence today. It's kind of an unfortunate thing, but just like what I mentioned earlier, Albert Pike even said that, and all the rabbis confirmed that because that whole book is essentially just a huge collaboration of rabbis for like thousands of years and Masonic leaders. They said that there will never come a day in this world where peace exists. It won't.
Yes.
Because of the natural proclivities of people, the fact that you have an ego, I have an ego, I see one thing, you see another, they see another, I see another. What's going to ultimately happen when people have to fight?
That's all okay, but it can still be a lot more peaceful than it is.
But this is what it comes down to. I think through example, because now let's say you're living a miserable existence, and then you see this guy knows how to do something like, even magic is just a very broad example, but if we even talk about liberation, imagine if you saw somebody who can control things with the mind, or levitate, or cure any kind of disease just by thought power alone because they know how to concentrate.
But you can't.
Tell me you wouldn't just be like, the life that I'm doing is useless.
Yeah.
I think it's very ironic because I noticed this particularly in the United States that everybody talks about sovereignty and they don't want responsibility or obligation, but then they want everybody to take care of them.
Yes, yes, exactly right. What is,
that's another question. Even just taking that example, where does the problem come from? Does it really come from the Illuminati potentially being sorcerers, or does it just come from people's just plain ignorance or indifference?
I don't know, so
Or training.
Or training. It is training. No, I think a lot of it has to do with training. There's a great interview on that by Norman Dodds by Edward Griffin. He interviewed a guy named Norman Dodds in the 80s. I don't know, you've seen it. It's a very short interview, like 45 or 50 minutes. And he basically discovered that there was, in point of fact, a legitimate conspiracy to re-educate people in the United States according to a certain program. And the idea is not so much to lie to them, but only teach them certain aspects of education that they would accept war, they would accept the necessity for government, they would accept the necessity of a state, and they would essentially enfeeble people just to be, like the Matrix said, you're just a battery, you're just energy, that's it. You know, you provide energy for the state and it goes back to it, because there is something very spiritually profound about that you can have 3,000,000 batteries working in your favor to take it and go against the world. I mean, there's really something very powerful about that. You think about it, it's muscle, you know, it's sheer dominance. And that's why I don't think people uprise against the government. I think it'll collapse on itself eventually. You know, it will. It has to. Just like we talked about the equilibrium, it'll just shift to too hard of an extreme, and it'll collapse. I think to internal tension. There is a certain spiritual accuracy in it, and by that I mean that it's like deceit. You know, like if you get a traffic ticket for $500, you think to yourself, why the hell did I get a traffic ticket for $500 when I can't even pay my bills? You know, what the hell is that about? Well, now when you take it back a little bit further, you consented voluntarily when you signed your driver's license for that. You said, basically, anything that I do, any kind of infraction or statute that I violate, I'll let them do whatever I want for me. They can revoke my license, they can take me to jail. The fact that you didn't read that 15,000-page manual is your problem.
Right.
I mean, but that's what it comes down to.
It's like when you buy software and it's like you're agreeing to the agreement. I don't know anyone that actually reads the agreement.
But the better question is, can you function without it? Because if you say no, you can't use it. So there you go. It's pretty much like, that's what it comes down to. It comes out of, ignorance or necessity. You have to conform to the standards, and because you have to conform to it, because the whole culture is conformed to it, they're not really doing anything bad, even though nobody likes it. Spiritually, they are kind of abiding by spiritual principles because you're voluntarily consenting to it. You're not happy about it. I'm not happy about it. People aren't happy about it. But out of necessity and ignorance, you have to.
You have to.
Because influence isn't control. You shouldn't mistake the two terms. Influence means that, I'm going to push you a little bit this way, but I'm not going to make you go right. And then if you happen to discover it under your own accord, then so be it. It's like, and that's kind of the trick to it, is they don't make you do anything. They influence you. It doesn't mean they control you. They don't say, go here and do this. They say, wouldn't you like to have a good lifestyle? Why don't you, if you become a doctor, you can drive a Mercedes and have a nice house on the beach and this and that. And you're thinking, well, I don't really want that, but it's better than living in an apartment in downtown LA. So it's like they kind of influence you. And now you've basically taken a life, that they projected towards you, that you just basically animated. You animated that character, and you give them a life, and then you give the life to their society, their ideologies, which then kind of comes back to that spiritual thing that they're utilizing you as a battery. The Upanishads and stuff like that, going back to that stuff, they mention that there's a tremendous amount of demons, beings, they call them the devas, which are basically the gods, and there's a tremendous amount of gods. They recommend just ignoring them when it happens, because what that comes down to is invocation. Which is what John did, was kind of like spirit invocation. You're basically summoning certain forces and certain powers to help assist you, which is the essence of black magic. And that's kind of like even that scene like we were talking about, Eyes Wide Shut. That's an invocation. That's actually what they're doing. They use incense, because the incense, when you're burning something, what it is it's supposed to be the material equivalent of communicating with the other side, because that's even like the pyramid. Pyramid means fire in the middle. You basically have fire, and the reason fire was always used is because it's a symbolic representation of the physical being transformed into the fire, the generative principle of the universe, and then evaporating into the etherical realms. That's that. It's a very symbolic process, and if that's coupled with the feeling of that, then it really becomes a type of magical ritual, which we understand as invocation. Who also talks about that a lot, if you're interested in that, is Manly P. Hall. There's a very short book you can read. It's called, what is it called? Spirit Entities. It's a very short book. You can buy it for like $5, and he talks about that, like invocation, summoning spirits to benefit you and not help you. One word of advice on that, it comes back to the thing, they don't give anything for free. It's like saying, he'll give you the world, but it's going to cost you something. I mean, and it's weird that at your weakest moment you seem to have your greatest inspiration, because it's kind of like the body, the ego seems to just give up. It's out of there. And it's like literally nothing but you. It's like nothing but you and the source at that point.
It's getting loaded, nothing.